Welcome everyone to See You on the Weekend. Today's lecture is titled Tales from Under the Mediterranean, Reminiscences of a Maritime Archaeologist. We'll be starting the program in just a couple of minutes. We're gonna give everyone time to get logged on and settled in. Thank you for your patience, and we'll be back shortly.
Greetings, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to See You on the Weekend. This is an ongoing series of lectures featuring cutting-edge research and creative work of CU Boulder's world-class faculty. Today's webinar is titled Tales from Under the Mediterranean, Reminiscences of a Maritime Archaeologist. My name is David Means, and I'll be your moderator. I am the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which is the unit that sponsors this series. We're so glad you could join us for today's program. Just a few logistics before we get started with the presentation. Attendees can submit questions throughout the talk by clicking on the question and answer or Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of the Zoom window. These will be sent to the presenter and the moderators for their consideration, but they will not be visible to other audience members. Due to the size of the audience, the chat function has been disabled for this talk. We may not have time to get to your question, but we will certainly do our best to address the themes and ideas that are most common. So be sure to submit those as they come in. That enables us to sort things on the back end and see where there's themes that are coming through, where there's a lot of interest from different participants. And we can make sure to get to those questions that have the most interest. So the webinar is also being recorded. And by Monday, we will add a link to the recording on our website, which is where you registered for the talk. All right, that stuff out of the way, it's my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker. Robert Hohlfelder is a professor emeritus and former chair of the Department of History at the University of Colorado Boulder. His special research interests are in ancient maritime history, the world of late antiquity, and ancient numismatics. I hope we learn what that word might be. That's actually, I should have asked in advance, but that one is still new to me. Throughout his career, Hohlfelder has written or edited 9 books, over 130 articles, and 60 plus reviews with his co-authored book, published in August 2014, Building for Eternity, The History and Technology of Roman Engineering in the Sea, which, and this is very unusual for academic titles, some of you will know, this text was reprinted in 2021. He has presented more than 155 papers at professional conferences in 13 countries and given more than 335 public lectures at universities and museums around the world. Professor Hohlfelder has received numerous prestigious honors and awards. He currently serves as a member of the UNESCO ICOMOS International Committee on Archaeological Heritage Management and as a liaison between ICAHM and the International Committee on the Underwater Cultural Heritage. He has served as a visiting research scholar at Oxford University's Wolfson College, and Professor Hohlfelder is currently working on a book to be entitled The Julio-Claudian Emperors and the Sea, Building a Maritime Infrastructure as a Nexus of the Roman Empire. All right, please join me in welcoming Professor Hohlfelder to See You on the Weekend.
Come on. Thank you, David, for the introduction. And thank all of you out there who have taken some time on a Saturday to help me share some memories with you. As David said, I've given a lot of lectures around the world, but I've never done a virtual one before. So this is a first for me. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to proceed, but I think it's best if I sort of pretend that you're in my living room, in my virtual living room, and I'm just talking to you. So I'll try to do that. If there are any technical glitches along the way, it's probably my fault. I forgot to push the right button or I pushed the wrong button at the wrong time, but we'll get through this. I'm going to add a couple of things to what David said. Most of my professional career has been spent either in, on, or under the Mediterranean, except for my years in the military. And of course, you might expect that since I have this love for the sea, that I was in the United States Army, not the Navy. That's the way things work. I had an opportunity to spend 30 years as a tour expert for National Geographic, the Smithsonian, the Lindblad expeditions, and the Archaeological Institute of America. I also had 30 years where I was a national lecturer for the Archaeological Institute of America. What I want to do today is I've selected 5 different events from my career to talk about, and I'll do it in chronological order, starting with the earliest one first. That will be a story about how a cut on my hand while I was involved in an underwater archaeological project in Greece led to the discovery of an amazing cache of artwork, 120 glass pictures that were made in the middle of the 4th century CE, shipped to this seaport in Greece in shipping crates and never unpacked. I'll have more to say about that a bit later. The second event I'm going to talk about is my discovery in the seas off Caesarea Maritima, an ancient city in now that's located between Tel Aviv and Haifa along the Israeli Mediterranean coast. Discovery in the sea of a huge block of what I thought was stone, 11 meters by 15 meters by 4 meters, found in the sea about 280 to 300 meters offshore. How it got there was the question I asked myself. I have a great deal of respect for ancient technology, but I could see no way that a block of that size could have been lifted from the shore, brought out and placed precisely in a north, south, east, west axis at the end of a artificial breakwater. That was a mystery to be solved. Then I'm going to shift gears and move to the island of Cyprus, where I also worked. And there I was intrigued by the story I heard about an underwater cave where amphora, that's the shipping crates of antiquities, ceramic containers that look something like this. This one is a bit gnarled. It's got all kinds of sea worms on it. Oh, by the way, if you wonder whether or not this is in the country legally, it is. But this, the story that I heard was that somehow these shipping containers of antiquity, the barrels or the crates that the ancients used to ship commodities about, somehow they had gotten into a cave and then mysteriously levitated, so they were stuck in the ceiling of the cave. That was another mystery to be solved. Then I will turn my attention to a work that I did with the Hellenic Center for Marine Research in Greece. That's their equivalent of Woods Hole or Scripps, doing some deep water explorations in the northern Aegean and off the island of Crete in the Sea of Crete. Two harrowing moments I had in an underwater submersible, a two-person submarine. And then finally, I will talk about the most dangerous moment I've ever had as an archaeologist. And this occurred in Turkey, near the city of Mersin, by the close to the border of Turkey and Syria. And there, that particular that episode did not occur in the water, but occurred on land. So those are the 5 things that I will talk about. I'll try to keep my comments limited to about 50 minutes. I have a lot to say about my career, but I'll try very hard to maintain or to keep my eye on the clock, so I leave time for questions and answers. Now, I know that some of you who are sitting in my virtual living room, I do know, and I know that you've asked me to talk about how this kid from Brooklyn, who didn't learn to swim until he was a senior in college, became a maritime archaeologist and historian at the University of Colorado, of all places. Now, our state is a wonderful state. We have wonderful natural features, but an ocean coastline is not one of them. I'll get to that a little later as well. I'll begin by saying even as an undergraduate classics major at Bowdoin College, I was really interested in how the ancient societies that existed along the Mediterranean coast related to the sea. What kind of ships did they have? Who were the sailors? What commodities did they trade in? How was trade organized? What were the sea lanes that these ancient vessels used? A whole series of questions. And I had started doing some reading even as an undergraduate, trying to find some answers. And I realized very quickly that there was practically nothing in our surviving literary sources that answered any of the questions I had. But nonetheless, I was still interested in trying to figure out some of the answers to these questions, but I didn't know how to proceed. When I entered graduate school, I was really very lucky. Well, in fact, I should say that right now, timing and luck is a good part of my story. But I entered graduate school. I took a course in my first year or two on the ancillary disciplines of ancient history, and that would be things like papyrology, the study of papyri, epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, and numismatics, the study of ancient coins. And during the seminar, I had a chance to work with ancient coins, and I became really intrigued by them. I realized that in the period of time that I was interested in, when there was no social media, no radio or television, the way that political leaders reached the people were messages that they could put on coins. The coins themselves, by varying the types of coins, they were able to provide different types of messages, things that the leaders of that society wanted the people to know about the way they were governed and the way the governors wanted people to see them. So in other words, coins could be propaganda as well as historical documents. Really excited about this in the seminar. And then I got, again, extremely lucky. The professor of that seminar told me that there was a summer program at the American Numismatic Society in New York where graduate students like myself could go and learn how to be a numismatist. I thought this was a terrific idea. I applied and again got very lucky. I did receive one of these fellowships. And I went to New York to study with a very distinguished European numismatist, Professor Otto Merkholm from Denmark, to learn more about how coins could tell us about the ancient past. Then I got lucky again. I was in graduate school at Indiana University in 1963, when the University of Chicago and Indiana University decided to have a joint 5-year archaeological project at a place called Cancri in Greece. It was one of the ancient seaports for the city of Corinth. And I was really keen on this because I realized that material culture would tell us a lot about the ancient world, just as literary sources would. This would sort of, in a way, expand my horizon and my understanding of how ancient societies functioned. Well, I got lucky once again, because at the last minute, the numismatist, who was a faculty member of the University of Chicago, dropped out of the project, and the project did not have an ancient numismatist. I had this fresh new credential from the American Numismatic Society saying that I was a fledgling numismatist, and I was asked to take on that responsibility for the project in Greece. And at the same time, I was looking for dissertation topics, and my advisor said, well, maybe studying the coin finds that we're going to have in the next 5 years and what they tell us about the city of Cancri would be an interesting dissertation. I thought so, signed on, and away I went. That's how my archaeological career began. What I hadn't realized then was that this was in 1963. I hadn't realized that in 1960, 2 very important projects had occurred in the waters of the Mediterranean that really marked the beginning of the transition from just simple salvage of antiquities from the sea to science in the sea, the science of maritime archaeology. One project had occurred in Turkey, headed by a then graduate student, George Bass from the University of Pennsylvania. This was an excavation of a shipwreck, an ancient shipwreck from the Bronze Age. The same year, at Caesarea Maritima in Israel, an oceanographer named Edwin Link had brought a team of divers to begin explorations of the underwater remains of the harbor complex of Caesarea. It was a little different because there, the archaeologists in charge stayed on board ship, and professional divers, scuba divers, went down and did the work and then reported back to the scientists what they had found. The methodology leaves a lot to be desired. I think that's pretty obvious, but this again marked an important beginning. I had no idea that this was going on when I finally arrived at Cancri as an ancient numismatist, not having a clue what that really meant in the field. But when I got to Cancri, I was absolutely stunned that part of this city was submerged. The breakwaters that formed the harbor of this city had, over the course of the centuries, disappeared beneath the waves. So here I was with my interest in ancient maritime affairs at the very beginning of the discipline of maritime archaeology at a city that had sunken remains. I bought my first mask and snorkel in Athens and spent whatever spare time I had, and that was usually in the afternoons. Our days started very early at Cancri, around 5 o'clock in the morning. We worked until about noon, and then after lunch there was a siesta during the heat of the day, and we started late in the afternoon. Well, during the siesta, on most days, I spent my time swimming over the submerged rooms of Cancri. I was literally swimming over time. That was it. I was hooked. That was the beginning for me of maritime archaeology. Let's see. I have to move. Let's see. How do I move my slides?
Okay, use your arrow.
There we are. Pardon me, a little glitch here. Oh, good. I want to talk a little bit about how archaeology really began and the various types of archaeology. You can see from my slide here how archaeology beneath the Mediterranean has expanded our knowledge of of how the ancients related to the sea. And some of the questions that I had as an undergraduate have been and are being answered even as we speak today, as the science of maritime archaeology proceeds. But as I said before, it starts with salvage. And here we have an image of a bunch of fishermen, if you see on the right-hand side of this piece of relief, who are hauling out of the sea a statue of Heracles. This relief is at the museum in Ostia, which was the seaport of ancient Rome. And it depicts an event that happened that the fishermen who were involved in this had no idea how that statue got there. They thought it must have been a gift from the gods. They brought the statue on shore and then built a temple to honor Heracles, believing that that was in fact the divine will. This type of salvage, in other words, chance finds of objects in the sea, have been going on for antiquity right up to the present. In the middle of the 19th and early 20th century, when hard helmet diving began, more shipwrecks were found, and statues like the one you see here, this wonderful bronze statue, was found off the island of Antikythera by hard helmet divers. And for those of you who have been to Athens, and those of you who are hoping to go to Athens, in the National Museum, you'll find a whole series of wonderful bronze statues. Just about all of them have come from the sea. Now, as to one of the questions I had about maritime affairs in antiquity had to do with ships, ancient ships. How were they constructed? And the image you see here is I was working with Bill Kurtzinger, a National Geographic photographer, and he's got the camera and I've got light. And we're filming here, we're taking an image of a graffiti that was scribbled on one of the ship's timbers of a ship that was found off the coast of Caesarea Maritima. Shipwrecks really have captured or did capture the fancy of the public when marine archaeology started, and I guess they still do. An ancient shipwreck is a time capsule. It tells us about a specific moment of time, and it's been very important to us to have these shipwrecks to learn more about how ancient ships were actually constructed and built. I have an image here of a shipwreck. This is the type of thing we hope to find. You can see thousands and thousands of these amphorae, of these storage containers resting on the ocean floor in a shipwreck off the coast of Marseille. And you'll notice that they have no stoppers. The stoppers were probably pieces of leather that were tied on, or maybe even cork. And over the course of the last 2 millennia, they disappeared. We keep hoping, by the way, that we'll find one of these ancient amphoras with a cork still in place, or a ceramic container lid in place, and the wine that the amphora contained was still there to be consumed today. A couple of them have been found like that, but unfortunately the wine has not survived. Now, with information that we've gotten from shipwrecks and also from reproductions and mosaics and so on like this one of what an ancient ship looked like, we have a pretty good idea now about ancient ship construction. So much so that it was possible, for example, when I put together a show for the Smithsonian on Caesarea, we were able to use the material from that shipwreck that you saw earlier, where I was working with the National Geographic photographer, the information we got from that, plus study of other shipwrecks that were found, to create a model, which you see here on the left, of what an ancient merchantman looked like. A ship like this was pretty big. In fact, it was probably larger than anything that sailed the Mediterranean after the Roman period until sometime probably into the beginning of the 18th century. It could carry perhaps as much as 1,500 tons of cargo. I have on the right of this, you can see a modern ship, the Sea Cloud 1, and you'll notice it has many sails. The ancient ships were probably the most complex machines that the ancient world ever built. But interestingly enough, they never got very far in terms of the technology of sails. Ancient vessels usually had a foresail and a mainsail, and maybe a topsail, but usually no more than 3 sails. And you can see what a tall ship from the more modern era has. The Sea Cloud carries 32 sails. Now, the fact that we have now learned so much from looking at ancient shipwrecks about how an ancient ship was constructed, it's been possible to actually go ahead and make reproductions. of ancient ships. This is one of them. This is a new branch, if you will, experimental archaeology. This is a ship that was a shipwreck that was found off the coast of Cyprus in the 60s at a place called Kyrenia. And here you have a reproduction of this ship. This is pretty much the type of vessel that was used throughout the Mediterranean antiquity. Again, with one sail, it was about 15 meters long, carried a crew, sometimes as many as 4 people, moving from port to port, mostly along the coast, though some open water sailing. And this particular vessel, there have been 3 reproductions of the Kyrenia made. This one you're looking at here actually sailed into the harbor in Athens, Piraeus, in 2004 as part of the opening of the Olympic Games. The most impressive ancient shipwreck, reproduction is this one, the Olympias, a reproduction of an ancient warship from an Athenian trireme from the 5th century BC. This was the ultimate weapon of naval warfare at the time. And it was this vessels like this, that enabled Athens to build a maritime empire. This too sailed into the harbor of modern Piraeus harbor in 2004, returning the Olympic torch that had moved around the world. It came back to Athens to start the beginning of the games that year, the Olympic Games. I got involved in experimental archaeology in a very different way. I will be talking a bit later about a concrete project that I had, a study of Roman marine concrete, which was called the Roman Maritime Concrete Study, and their abbreviation is RomaCons. I'll be referring to that, where we did some reverse engineering, having studied how looking at surviving concrete monuments that are scattered throughout the Mediterranean from the Roman period. We were able to come up with a plan to try to reproduce a Roman pier underwater using the same tools that the Romans had available and using the same materials that the Romans had. We were able to figure that out from our study of the existing ruins. And here I am working on the last phases of this Roman pier or pila in the Bay of Brindisi in Italy. And I'm putting on the last layer of mortar on this. And I have sprinkled some 21st century euro coins in the mix so that archaeologists in the future, if they ever get around to looking at this, will know when it was built. But also I kind of smiled to myself thinking, I wonder how people in the future, maybe 500 years down the road, and I'm assuming this is going to last because Roman concrete is extraordinarily durable in the sea. What will they think if they find a 21st century coin in a Roman concrete pier? Now that could be the beginning of a very interesting dissertation for someone. It's a little impish on my part, but anyway, I did it anyway. So we'll have more to say about Roman concrete. But I want to turn my attention now to the first of my examples that occurred at Kenkrea, Greece. And you see my arrow here pointing to the location of Kenkrea and the Isthmus of Corinth. The ancient harbor of Kenkrea was more or less circular. You can see there are remains of 2 breakwaters that formed the harbor, but I'm going to be talking about what was found where the arrow is pointing now. And you can see a little bit better here how visible the ruins were and how excited I was when I first got there and started swimming over these. Being able to swim down an ancient street, for example, was very exciting. But of real interest was this building that you see where the arrow is. It's an apsidal building. I've got perhaps a better image of it here. And what made this interesting is that the Greek workmen that we had on this project, Kenkrea was pretty isolated then. There was no electricity, no water in the area, no roads to get to it except donkey trails. And we came out there and we literally lived on the beach in the first year. And there were workmen coming to us from 5 different villages around the area. And they would come in early Monday morning and stay until Saturday, midday Saturday, and go home. Wonderful time sleeping on the beach. Listen, there was one gentleman I'll never forget. a man named Yorgos Christos, who on evenings, certain evenings when we had a bonfire and enough ouzo or retsina had been consumed, he would begin to sing the Iliad. He had learned it by heart from his father and his grandfather, who in turn had learned it from their grandfather. I was absolutely stunned. That again was like a window opening to the ancient past. But what made this room so exciting is that, or so interesting to us, was that all of the workmen from the 5 different villages had the same story to tell, that this building was where St. Paul had worshipped during his time in Corinth, when he came to Corinth, when he left Corinth. This was a place, this was his chapel. Again, how do you know this? My grandfather told me. How did he know it? His grandfather told him. So again, we had this tradition going back into the mists of time about the importance of this building. And as we started in 1963, I should back up one year when I had been swimming around there. At the end of that season, I had asked the director of the dig, Bob Scranton, if it was possible, or I guess I asked him first of all, when is he going to start looking at the ruins in the sea? And he said to me, well, we don't do that. I said, oh. So then I asked him if I learned how to scuba dive, would it be possible with his license to be able to do something in the sea? And he said, yes, but we don't know how to do anything. And I said, fine. Another fellow who was on the project at the time, Joe Shaw, who went on to become a very distinguished Minoan archaeologist, teaching at the University of Toronto. Joe and I decided that we were going to have a season in 1964 and do some underwater archaeology, but we didn't know how to do any of it. We were, in a sense, creating things as we went along. Now, to do anything in this building was really tricky because the water was very shallow. But if you look carefully, you can see in the middle, looks like there's something almost at the surface. This was the remains of some sort of a floor that had been placed over it. And as we began excavations here, and we did it the only way we could think of was to get a high pressure hose, a fire hose, if you will, and create a jet of water that was over the area that we were excavating, and then to fan sand and silt up into this artificial current that we had that would carry it away. But it couldn't carry it very far because see, the building is almost intact. So what would happen is we lost all of our visibility and we were working essentially blind. But what we did discover almost immediately, we found there was about a meter below the level of this floor, there was a mosaic floor. That was very interesting. And we started then from the shore working out with this hose, excavating. And it was on one of these occasions when, just as we had reached where the level of the floor is, I was working there and I stuck my hand. I couldn't see a bloody thing because by then visibility had disappeared. Put my hand in and I got a sharp cut. I touched some glass. This is terrible. This must be a beer bottle or something. This is a disturbed context. We're never going to find anything of interest. But nonetheless, we stopped work, and about 2.5 hours, 3 hours later, the visibility had cleared enough that we could see what it was that I had cut my hand on. And it turned out it wasn't a beer bottle. It was the remains of a glass picture, beautifully colored, even then, beautifully colored. We had no idea what it was, but it was of sufficient importance at the time that the director of the project said, stop, we're going to have to figure out a better way of doing this, of excavating this. This could be very important. This was in 64. 65, 66, 67, the United States Army had other things for me to do. I was not there when the excavation of this actually occurred. And the way Bob Scranton decided to do it, because he realized that with high pressure water hose and fragile glass pictures, if the hose was pointing in the wrong direction, the glass picture might disappear. He decided to build a cofferdam around this structure and then pump all the water out and excavate as if it were on land. And I have an image, I was not here for this, but this cluster of things you see here are the glass panels in a shipping crate. What they discovered were 9 shipping crates like this, filled with these glass panels that had been packed face to face with straw as dunnage. They would use plastic bubbles and they used straw. And over time, what had happened was that the straw disappeared and the glass, unfortunately, had come together and fused together, making this a restoration nightmare. But some work was done almost immediately, and we discovered that there were some beautiful pictures. You see this figure here, very saint-like, almost Christ-like. But above this, and you can't see it in the slide, but there is a Greek inscription telling us that this is Homer. And Homer appears with a nimbus around his head, like he wasn't a saint. And it's a very interesting combination of, here we have a pagan art that has borrowed Christian symbolism. The middle of the 4th century, things are moving in two directions. Christian symbolism is moving into pagan world, and paganism is moving into Christian symbolism. The panels themselves date from about the middle of the 4th century, the century when the empire was beginning to Christianize. Very, very interesting. Timing is everything, as I said. Unfortunately for the panels, they were discovered at the wrong time. This was the panels, the last stack of panels had been removed in 1968. This was a time when Greece was under the control of a military junta, and they didn't care very much about archaeological remains. And unfortunately, these panels were not preserved as they should have been. In fact, I went to visit a museum in Greece nearby, a place called Isthmia, where some of these panels were on display, the ones we had preserved. And I asked to see the rest of them, and they were sitting in the back storeroom, just rotting in front of my eyes. It has been only recently that the Greek government has decided to try to do something with this. It's unfortunate. This was a unique discovery of ancient art, and unfortunately, we're not going to learn as much as we could have. Timing is everything. They came to light at the wrong time. Now I'll shift gears and go back and move now to Israel. And this is in 1981, where I'm looking from my helicopter here. I took a picture of the coastline, looking north from Caesarea towards Haifa. As I said, Caesarea is located midway between Haifa and Tel Aviv. You can see in this image a picture of an aqueduct that was coming into the city, and you can also see where the coast has eroded and part of the aqueduct has washed away. That is a direct effect of the fact that the harbor was built out into the sea and deflected a longshore or a south to north current that runs across the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean. The aqueduct is in itself interesting. It runs all the way up to Mount Carmel, which many of you have heard about, I'm sure, from a variety of sources. And the Romans had been able to build this aqueduct and tunnel under Mount Carmel for several miles, because the water that feeds the aqueduct comes from the wrong side, or the east side of Mount Carmel. One episode I'm not going to talk about is when I tried with my diving gear to dive through the existing tunnel underneath Mount Carmel until I got stuck. But that's another story. But anyway, I'm talking now about this block that I found. And again, the arrow indicates where this would have been the entranceway to the ancient harbor. And I knew about this block because Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, told us about the building of this harbor and told us how King Herod was able to lower stones into the sea to build these artificial breakwaters out from a sandy coastline, to build an international harbor where none had existed before. An incredible accomplishment. So I knew the stones were there, but I had no idea that they were this large. As I said, when I first saw them, this first block, I was stunned. Such a large, again, something beyond the engineering abilities of the society that built this breakwater. The first thing that came to my mind was, aha, I have positive evidence now of alien intervention. No other way it could have happened. But happily for me, I did not rush into publication with this theory and figured I should, in fact, maybe look a little bit more carefully. And what turns out is that Josephus was wrong. He was writing his text about maybe 75 years after the actual building of the harbor, so he wasn't around when it was done. But he did not know that it was not stone that was lowered into the sea. It was concrete. It was maritime concrete. And Herod, while he had wonderful builders working for him, he had no one who had the expertise a building in the sea. That was something that required the intervention of Roman engineers. Now, what we're looking at here, you can see in the corner of this structure, you can see the remains of 2 wooden tie beams. Now, I had to figure out how this could possibly have been done. This is my answer. This appeared in a National Geographic article that I wrote in the 80s. You can see here a wooden frame being towed into position. And this is wooden formwork into which concrete, and concrete is a mixture of mortar and aggregate. The Latin word for aggregate is cimenta. Mortar and aggregate create concrete. And that's exactly what was done. But not stone. This was concrete structure. And nothing like this is recorded in our ancient texts. We know the ancient texts talk about Roman concrete in the sea, but they do not give us any idea of the construction using this methodology. I think I am right, but it was interesting anyway to do this. A little later on in time, when my Romacons project, remember back up now, I mentioned the building of that pila or pier in the harbor of Brindisi. That was part of the Romacon project. Here, the other 2 co-directors of that project, on the left is Chris Brand, on the right, John Olisad. Here we are taking a core from the center of one of these Roman monuments. We took cores of ancient concrete monuments throughout the Mediterranean to see if, in fact, there was a similarity in building, that they use the same building materials and so on. And we had all of these cores analyzed at a research laboratory for Italcementi in Bergamo, Italy. So we had cores from everywhere in the Mediterranean analyzed in the same laboratory, same equipment, same scientists, so no one could accuse us of having apples and oranges. What was a real surprise to us is that the mortar that was used in the concrete, the key ingredient was a volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples. Now, from Bay of Naples to Caesarea, about 1,200 miles. What we also did while we're at Caesarea, we looked at every block of stone or concrete that was still there underwater. We were amazed at how much concrete was there. And we were able to figure out that to build the breakwaters at Caesarea out of concrete, something in the neighborhood of 20,000 tons of volcanic ash had to be exported from the Bay of Naples, imported by Herod to build his harbor. That's a staggering logistical issue. And again, in our ancient texts, make no reference to the transport of volcanic ash to make mortar throughout the Mediterranean. But every place we cored, everywhere in the Mediterranean, we found that Roman engineers used volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples. We even found it in use outside of the Mediterranean in Portugal, in Roman villas that were built on the sea, where the elite built fish tanks. They used Roman concrete that had mortar from the Bay of Naples. We even have had reports that some of this volcanic ash has been found in places as far away as India. In other words, we're talking about a massive trade. Again, nothing like this in the literature. This has been, the thing that's made this so interesting is that this Roman concrete, marine concrete, has survived for 2,000 years. There are material scientists who have told me that this is the most durable substance that humankind has ever made. I'll let that one sit for a minute. But all of our work has wound up in this publication of this book that was mentioned by Dave, Building for Eternity, which came out in 2014 and republished in 2021. It was an incredible hit. I was stunned. For example, the first run of the book went out of print very quickly. They sold more than I ever expected. And I was looking on used bookstores, and I saw copies of this book going for $400 in 2020. And they decided to reprint it as a paperback. So it's still possible to buy this for about $40 on Amazon. Just go on Google and you can find places to buy it. And it made, for a while, it made me the flavor of the month. Everybody was wanted to talk about Roman concrete. It's kind of exciting. Okay, I move on because I'm going to be running out of time soon. I want to talk about the find of the cave of the Amphras at Cyprus. We're working at Paphos. You can see the remains of the ancient breakwater here at the seaport of Paphos. And where we had our tanks filled at a local dive shop that was run by a bunch of Australians. Really nice fellas. We really had a good time with them. Maybe some nights we had too much fun with them, but one night after a party, one of the dive masters said, "Have you seen the cave, the underwater cave where the amphora is stuck in the ceiling?" And I thought, sure, I've heard this story before. I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories like this from local people about shipwrecks that went down, ancient shipwrecks, and it turned out it was a dinghy that went down last week. But I heard this, and he was insistent, this fellow was insistent that I go out and take a look at it, this cave of the amphoras. Not far from Paphos, there's a reef called the Mulia Rocks. When the sea is calm, you can see the reef. When the sea is not calm, you don't see it, and it's a navigation hazard. And we went out, when diving, he couldn't find it, and I thought, oh, it's not going to happen again. It's another one of these wild goose chases. But then all of a sudden, I was looking around, and I saw bubbles coming out from the reef itself, and sure enough, I went down, and I found he was there. It was a cave, and there they were. At the ceiling of the cave are these amphora. Now, how the devil did they get there? The flying pots of Paphos. I thought I had another exciting story to tell. But once again, I don't think it was because there was some magic involved, or his explanation was that, well, maybe there had been fruit in these pots and the fruit fermented and the gases were able to lift the pots to the ceiling of the cave. Not a chance. What did happen, again, here we are with my colleagues taking some measurements inside the cave. My explanation for this is that what happened at some point in time was a ship carrying these amphora crashed into the Mulia Rocks. The ship sank, the cargo spread all over the top of the reef. What then happened, Cyprus is right on a place where two tectonic plates meet. It's a very active geological area. And I think what happened is during one of the earthquakes, the reef was breached, the sea entered and scoured out below what had been the cargo lying on top of the reef, suddenly became the roof of a cave that was created by the sea breaching. And that's as good of an explanation as I have for it. I think it's probably a lot better than thinking about pots suddenly rising from the ocean floor by themselves, having marched into the cave. Now, I switch gears now to my time with the Hellenic Center for Marine Research in the Northern Aegean here, working in a small two-person submarine called the Thetis, the mother of Achilles, a sea goddess, perfect name for a Greek submersible. You can see it's a little cramped. It looks a bit like one of the early helicopters, one of the MASH helicopters. You can see me inside getting ready to make a dive in this submarine. And here we are about to head down. Once you're in there was no backup on this. This was it. They had one submarine. If something happened, that was the end. Well, my first dive, we were down about, I would say, probably close to 1,000 feet, looking at a target that we'd found something on the sonar that looked like an ancient shipwreck. We went down to take a look at it, and I had asked all the right questions. Electric batteries, fine. What happens if the electric batteries fail? Not to worry, Bob. There's redundancy. We have another set of them. They will kick in immediately. Good. What about air? Oh, no problem there. We have a second system there too. If first air supply stops, we have redundancy there. Good, good. All of that sounded wonderful. We got down to the bottom and just about ready to start. And again, what I might mention, since we're dealing with electric batteries here, as you're making a descent in the submarine, there's only a small little strobe light out there that is available. When you get down in the Mediterranean about 325 feet, you lose all of your ambient light and it is dark. But to keep the sanity of the people inside the submarine, there's a little strobe light. It doesn't take much electricity. The big lights, the searchlights, go on when you actually reach the bottom and you begin to do your survey. And they give you visibility of about maybe 35, 40, maybe 50 feet, depending on the clarity of water. So we reached the bottom. My first dive, hit the bottom, and all of a sudden, lights go out, stop, engine stops, the motor stops. Seconds pass. I say to Nikos, when does the redundant system kick in? He said, soon. Well, I don't know how long it took. It seemed like a century before all of a sudden we had lights again, electricity. And I said to him, I think we should probably abort this dive. And he said, this is a very good idea. And up we came. And apparently I asked him then, well, how many times have you done this? He says, well, this is the first one. And he had forgotten something on his checklist, and there had been flooding that flooded out the system, but happily the redundant system worked. That was a very anxious moment, because at whatever it was, 1,000 feet, 600 feet, there was no way for me to get out. I knew that that could have easily been the end, and that maybe that was not an inappropriate way for a marine archaeologist to go, but I wasn't ready to go yet. That was the first harrowing moment. The second one came the following year. By then he was quite experienced, and this sort of thing didn't happen. But we were moving along. We had found it again, once again, a target of a possible shipwreck. We were looking for shipwrecks in the northern Aegean that could date to the time when Persia, in the 5th century BC, when Persia had invaded Greece. And we know from our ancient texts, the writings of Herodotus, that Persians ran into a lot of storms and they lost a lot of ships, and there were a couple of battles where they also lost some. So we thought it would be a target-rich environment. But we had located a potential target, and again, we went down, this time hit the bottom, and then turned on the lights. The submarine has a sonar, so we had a reading about what was going on around us for further than our visibility of 50 feet, maybe about 75 to 100 feet with a sonar. We start out, and there's a very strong current. We're going in, believe it or not, there was a very strong current. We were heading into it, and all of a sudden, in our sonar reading, some large object appears on our sonar and is heading right for us. What could it be? Nikos, what is this? He's never seen anything like it. Getting closer, closer, and closer. And all of a sudden, it comes out of the mist into our lights, and we can see it. It's a giant squid. And the squid smashes right into the bubble. And the squid, ink goes everywhere. The squid sort of shakes its head and moves away. It didn't die. Scared the devil out of us. And all I could think, after we calmed down a bit and said, okay, maybe we should think about going up this time, because maybe there was some damage to the bubble. But all I could think about was what the story that squid might have to tell that night to its buddies. I encountered the mothership. It tried to capture me, but I escaped. Sure, we believe you. Anyway, that was a harrowing moment too. But the scariest moment of all, I put this slide up now to show you that marine archaeology, maritime archaeology is now facing the same kind of questions that we are for the space program. Does it make sense to send people down in submarines when we can do maybe more efficient work using robots? We now have underwater robots that will go down to the deepest waters of the entire oceans, down 36,000 feet. In our little submarine, for example, to get down 1,000 feet, or I guess the max was something about close to 1,500 feet in the submarine. It took about 40 or so minutes to get down, 40 or so minutes to get up. That didn't give us very much time on the bottom. Does it make any sense? And I think the answer to that will be probably not, that henceforth most of the work will be done by robots. Now, the most harrowing, or the scariest moment I've had occurred at ancient harbor called Pompeiapolis, located near the city of Mersin. And you can see from this aerial slide, you can see Mersin in the distance, and you can see the ancient harbor here. And the arrow points to a road, and that becomes very critical in the story. This was a project that the harbor itself was built. We know from ancient texts that the Romans built a harbor here towards the end of the 2nd century CE or AD, and it was sort of from my perspective, it was sort of the achievement, the crowning achievement of ancient harbor construction. I always wanted to go here. I visited it, but I want to do some coring to see whether or not, even then, the Roman engineers were still going to the Bay of Naples to find the critical volcanic ash to make the mortar. A lot of trouble getting permission to do this. In Turkey, you're not allowed to take any archaeological samples out of the country. I was able, actually on the advice of the Archaeological Service in Turkey, they said, well, why don't you just do your course and then call them geological samples? You can take geology out of the company. That sounded like a good idea. And through a contact of I have of an archaeologist, an American archaeologist who's worked in Turkey for many years, he put me in contact with a Turkish archaeologist who had the permit to work on this site. The Turkish archaeologist was interested in the Hittites, an early civilization in Asia Minor. He could care less about the Roman stuff, but his permit included that. Met him, talked to him, told him what I wanted to do. He said, fine. I gave myself 3 weeks to do my coring here. Had to ship all the equipment in through Turkish customs, which was tricky. We did that by the Italcimenti, the sponsor of my project, was able to send our drilling equipment to a subsidiary company, concrete company in Turkey, and that helped get it through customs, because getting materials through customs in Turkey is a difficult story. Anyway, material arrived in Istanbul, and there was a customs strike. Goes on for 2 weeks. I had 3 weeks altogether. When it finally came time, when the strike was over and it clears customs, we discovered that the shipping container that I had all my gear in didn't fit in the plane that flies between Istanbul and Adana, the nearest airport. I had to arrange at the last minute to have the material trucked down to the site. That took some time. Then it had to go through customs locally. And then I learned from Ramsey, the first name of the archaeologist who was working here, that he had decided to cut his project short because he ran out of money. So instead of having 3 weeks, I wound up with 1 day to do the work I wanted to. Okay, we started. I'm coming in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, get down here, there's a gate across the road. The gate's locked. I'd been told in advance, just the night before, that Ramsey said to me, oh, by the way, you may have some problems getting into the site. Oh, I didn't need to hear that. What kind of problems? Well, you know that the motel down there by the entrance to the site? Well, that's the center of a Turkish mafia. And that's where objects are smuggled into and out of Turkey across the Syrian border. That's where these fellows live. And they don't really like anybody going down to the harbor. Well, I didn't need to hear that, but I wasn't about to be deterred. I decided I'm going to go anyway. Got down there, there was a gate there. I was able to dismantle the fence to the side of the gate and drive my vehicle around there, down onto the site, set up my gear and start working. Here's my team. Again, John Olison to the right. I guess I would say he's the leading authority in ancient technology in the world, and Chris Brandon representing the Nautical Archaeological Society. He owned a very large architectural firm in London at the time, and then me. We'd started to take our core, and then I looked down, and out of this motel had come 5 of the nastiest, biggest men I'd ever seen in my life, all carrying lead pipes, starting to walk down in our direction. There was no way off this breakwater. I thought, oh, this is going to be trouble. They meant business. As they got just about to where that wooden building is, in the distance, flashing police lights, sirens, I couldn't believe I don't know what was happening. And I thought, are they coming here? And sure enough, they came here, stopped at the lock gate. A policeman got out, walked in, got a key, opened the door, came out. These 5 men with the pipes, as the police cars were coming closer, just sort of vanished, stepped away, put their pipes away, and quietly walked back to the motel. And as cavalcade of cars comes up, there's a television vehicle there, TV cameras. Out of one of these vehicles steps the mayor of Mersin. He has seen He somehow learned that the archaeologists from around the country world have come to look at his harbor, and he wanted to have a moment on television, for local television that night, of meeting the archaeologists and shaking our hands and all that. So he came out and threw my colleague my American archaeologist who had worked in Turkey. He was with us. He was our interpreter, and the mayor asked all the right questions. I shook his hand. He saw what I was doing, all of that. And the cameras are rolling. He got what he wanted, and he turned around. And in typical fashion, he said, "Is there anything I can do for you, Bob, to help you work?" I said, "Yes. We only have a day to work. If you don't mind putting a police car down at the end of the breakwater so we're not disturbed." And he said, "No problem." So he did, and we finished. How about that? Talk about luck. I've had a lot of it in my career. I want to end this quickly now because I know we're on time for questions. I have to show a fish picture. Underwater archaeologists are expected to do this. This is a large fish called a Napoleon or humpback wrasse or Napoleon wrasse from the picture taken at in the Red Sea. I was diving here with my wife, Catherine, and she was somewhere else, and I was trying to draw our attention to the fact that this fish was following me around. As a big animal. They can be as large as 300 pounds, can be almost the size of a Volkswagen. He was very friendly. He was following me all over the place. I hadn't realized that the Egyptians who had taken over, I had been down here when the Israelis had control of Sinai at Sharm el-Sheikh, but now the Egyptians were in control. They allowed divers to feed fish, which I think is a terrible idea. And apparently this particular fish was very used to getting hard-boiled eggs from divers. And he was following me around, waiting for me to give him the hard-boiled egg. I didn't have any, but I'm waving to my wife saying, "Come on down here." And the fish thought I was calling him over, and he came over and grabbed my hand in his mouth. And here's an animal that survives by crunching coral. It was like having my hands, someone slamming a car door in my hand. I had my camera around my neck, and with one hand in his mouth, my other hand, I started punching him in the nose to see if he let go. He's looking at me very strangely, like I'm not, where's the egg? I don't understand. He did eventually let go. I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of that, but I was very lucky because I was diving in the area. Was a Roman mosaicist who got a picture of what was going on. So I was very lucky about that. Now, we don't know anything about who these Roman engineers were. We have one inscription that's come to us from mentioning a man named Lucius Julius Valens, a Caimentarius, and he was stationed with the imperial fleet, the Roman imperial fleet, at the city of Misenum, which was where the Western military naval fleet for the Romans was based. And I have a little sketch of what he looked like going off to work in the morning. Caimentarii, those were the master builders who constructed these ancient monuments in the sea that have survived for 2,000 years. Again, one quick slide, end of the day for me. The top, I was mixing mortar for our Pila construction, for the pier construction. I've never worked so hard in my life since finishing ranger training. End of the day, I was just happy as could be that this was not my career. The bottom slide could have been a very bad day. I like to take shark pictures, but it's very difficult usually to get a shark coming at you head on. Most of my shark pictures I show swimming away. This one was coming right at me and maybe a little bit closer than I would have liked, but happily it decided to just go over my head. And so it really wasn't the end of me, but it could have been a very bad day. I end with thanking you again for your time, spending some time with me as I shared some memories. And I wish you all fair winds and following seas, traditional nautical greeting or phrase for you. And again, thanks again for your time. I'll be very happy in a few minutes to answer any questions you have. Turn it over to someone else.
Great, thank you so much, Bob. We're getting some questions. Everyone do please submit those questions using that Q&A button on your Zoom window. As those come in, a question that we just got from someone named Sally, Bob, has to do with Roman concrete and why can't we routinely mimic Roman concrete today? And maybe a broader question, how does concrete today that's commonly used compare with, how is it different from or similar to Roman concrete?
Great question. First of all, I'd say that modern Portland cement, which is about as close as we have to it, using that to make concrete that's used in the sea, that will normally last somewhere between 30 and 50 years. The Roman maritime concrete that I'm talking about has survived for 2,000 years and counting. So the question is, why can't we use the information from the ancient world and create a better concrete? And the answer is we're looking at that. We are seriously looking at that. First of all, there isn't enough volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples to provide all the concrete that we needed for maritime concrete around the world. Does any volcanic ash work? No. The stuff from the Bay of Naples has a distinct chemical composition that when it's made, mixed with slaked lime and salt water, not fresh water, it produces a substance called aluminum tobermarite. And this is the key to the survival, to the longevity of Roman concrete. What essentially happens in Roman concrete is the exterior surface of the concrete block, the pores begin to close over time as it cures to a point where essentially the concrete becomes waterproof. Now, can we duplicate this in some way? I would say that really since the publication of the book that I mentioned, there's been a renewed interest amongst material scientists in trying to do just this. How can we recreate Roman concrete? And in fact, there's a program that the US Army Corps of Engineers, I think it's called Engineering with Nature. They've just started this. And one of the things that I know they're looking at from a variety of directions, is there any way that we can recreate chemically the materials necessary to turn to ash or even basic sand into something more like what the Romans used? It's a good question, because just think about if we were able to come up with a durable maritime concrete now, given the challenges we face with rising sea levels because of climate change, and the fact that people here in Boulder and NOAA have predicted that possibly by the end of the century, sea levels will have gone up 2 meters. How much of Florida will be left? What about all of our cities on the coast, east and west? If we have to build seawalls to protect them, would it make sense to use a concrete that's going to last 100, 200, 300, 2,000 years, as opposed to concrete that lasts 50 years? The answer is yes. Maybe this is also an answer to, part of an answer to what we do with our nuclear waste. Could we create containers that would essentially harden into stone so that our nuclear waste is embedded in stone? Is that a possibility? There's a lot of things we might be able to do with it. So it's a great question. And I think the answer will be maybe in 25, 10 years, 15 years, maybe we'll be able to do it. Good question.
That's great. Interesting follow-up question here. Did the Romans know at the time that their concrete was that strong? And what would they have been comparing it to at the time?
The answer is no. I call them engineers. They're usually called engineers, but they're not engineers as we know them today. There was no modeling done. They didn't know what they were doing. They were great masters of empirical building. And what I mean by that is they tried things. If it worked, they continued to use it. If it didn't work, they didn't do it. And essentially Roman concrete came out of that. In the Bay of Naples area, where the first Roman concrete was used and discovered, maritime concrete was used and discovered, it probably was an effort by local builders to see if they could recreate what nature had already produced, given the realities of the chemical composition of the volcanic ash. There were natural places like particularly good bedrock that was much better than other places. That was essentially the beginnings of Roman concrete. So a good builder would say, well, gee, I wonder how I could do this. Maybe I should try that. There were a lot of failures, to be sure. But once they had something that worked, they stayed with it without necessarily knowing exactly how or why it worked. So that's how it came to pass. I'm sorry, was there another part to that question, Dave?
No, I think that covers it. For whoever submitted that question, if there's something missing, feel free to submit a follow-up. But I think that covers it. A question related to your biography and how this work is positioned. Bob, you had alluded to this earlier. What does a maritime archaeologist, how does a maritime archaeologist end up based out of Colorado?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, if you think about it, my laboratory, if you will, my archive is the Mediterranean, or was, still is, which means that no matter where I am in the United States, it's a long flight to Europe. And for reasons that I think most of us who are here in my virtual living room, who live in Colorado, know why I came and why I stayed. I sometimes like to say that I sort of paraphrase Caesar. I came, I saw, I stayed. A great place to live. I enjoyed skiing. I'm a fly fisherman, did a lot of wilderness backpacking. Colorado has always been my home, so why leave? That's the answer.
Great. So a question we got early on, and I'm not sure to which particular episode this was referring to necessarily, but anonymous attendee asks, is there an explanation for why these cities ended underwater? Oh
yeah, that's a good question. Between, let's say, the 2,000 years ago and now, I think the sea level increase has been probably about a half a meter at most, which doesn't account for why these cities have slumped. But if you build any structure out onto essentially on a sandy ocean or a muddy ocean floor, over time, the weight of the structure will have a process called liquefaction. And given storms and sea winds, if you don't maintain it constantly, what will happen is the facility will begin to sink. Also in the Mediterranean, there's a place where the Eurasian and the North African plates collide, why there are volcanoes like Vesuvius, for example, or why on the island of Cyprus, there are ancient structures that are 2 stories high. They've all been destroyed by earthquakes. The earthquakes themselves have caused a lot of movement of the coast. In my lifetime in the Bay of Naples, when I first started going there, I guess I was first there in 1968, there was a structure that was underwater. It was part of a Roman market. Today, it's completely out of the water, and the pillars are about 4 or 5 meters high. Unbelievable. In my own lifetime, that's the kind of movement you can have when you build on essentially what is a collision of tectonic plates. So basically, it's liquefaction and earthquakes cause the harbors to sink.
So we have a 2-part question from Mary. I'll ask the second part first. Is there still active work happening in marine archaeology? And then the first part of the question, is there space in marine archaeology for people who do not have classics or archaeology degrees? Can divers find work in marine archaeology and help with research?
Question. Maritime archaeology is really taking off now that we have these robots that can do most of the work for us, and lots of exciting things happen. I mean, recently, I'm sure many of the people sitting in my virtual living room have read about the discovery of Shackleton's ship in the Weddell Sea. I would say that within the next 50 years, probably we will have discovered we will have identified just about every ancient shipwreck that has ever happened. That's saying a lot. But as of right now, for example, there's a 40,000 mile mountain range underwater. Expands our planet. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is where most of people are familiar with it. We know less about that mountain range than we do about the surface of Mars. There's a lot we have to learn. So yes, maritime archaeology is going to happen. Now, happily, if you are interested, and I know there are some younger people here in the audience that I know are interested in possibly pursuing a career in maritime archaeology. My answer would be that if you're not particularly interested in working in the Mediterranean world, but thinking about other opportunities, I would say the best course of action is to maybe major in anthropology with an emphasis on archaeology. Do something during your studies, get some field work in archaeology to see if you like it. Because archaeology is, you don't discover wonderful things every day. Most of it is pretty routine, boring, sometimes boring work. But then there are moments of great excitement, to be sure. But to see if you like archaeology to begin with. And then there are a number of places in the United States and around the world now where you can go and get an advanced degree in maritime archaeology. There are opportunities for this in any of our states in the United States that are on the coast have a division of maritime archaeology now. That's a possibility of getting work there. So it is a career that one should think about pursuing, because I think as much as we've learned in the last 40 or so years about how shall I say this? No matter how many secrets Poseidon has been willing to share with us, there are more and better ones ahead.
So Ben asks a question related to something that you had mentioned. Why were you trying to swim through the aqueduct tunnel under Mount Carmel? And what was the story about getting stuck that you alluded to?
Okay. I had a theory that when the Roman, it's an unbelievable engineering job that the Romans could literally cut their way through Mount Carmel to bring a water source from one side of the mountain to the other and bring it down to Caesarea. Incredible, using gravity flow only. And I was under the, I thought that maybe in Mount Carmel itself that there were numerous channels that came into one large holding area. And I wanted to see whether or not what the channel was like. And there were places, I guess it was about every 40 meters, when the Romans were doing this, they built a shaft down and had their workmen work between these two shafts. And the tunnel itself was large. It was not large enough for me to stand in, but I could in fact swim in it, and there was still water in it, but a lot of mud had accumulated as well. So I thought, well, what I would do is I would be able to go down there, maybe with a line behind me, I could somehow, and I'm reading compasses and so on, I could somehow figure out what the course of the channel was, and would I find any large collection basin in the middle. Well, I got started in this, and almost immediately, again, because there was mud there, I lost my visibility, and I'm going along, and I did find one place that hollowed out where I could stand up, and I could see places where ancient lights had been. I figured, okay, this is a place where they had their lunch when they were working underground. Got back and I started moving along again. And then there was a very small area where I was trying, I had to take my tank off, and my pushing tank ahead of me. And I got my tank through this area, and I'm trying to work my way through a narrow part because there's been a collapse, and I got kind of stuck. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is not a good way to end my life. But I had a graduate student with me behind me, and he helped me by pulling on my legs, and I felt like Pooh Bear. I got stuck, and finally were able to pull me out. And I said to myself, this is a silly thing for me to do. This is why God made graduate students. Let them do it. But we didn't finish up. So I have no idea how the tunnels work under Mount Carmel, but that's what I was trying to do. And looking back on it, it was not my brightest decision, but I'm here to talk about it.
Great. So we've got a couple questions that relate to ancient archaeology and mythology or cultural and religious traditions. I know that folks probably often ask about Atlantis, given your research area. Is there anything that you have as far as sort of a standard response to the Atlantis question? Is it real?
Dude. Atlantis itself sits at the intersection of magic, mystery, history, legend. We love the story. We wish it was true. Boy, we wish it was true. But alas, it's not. To give you a little background, Plato mentions Atlantis in 2 of his dialogues. If he hadn't done that, we would not know anything about Atlantis. And I think at one time I was trying to figure out how much had actually been written about Atlantis. And I think it counted something like 4,000 or 5,000 different articles and books, movies, songs, television shows, all of it based on what Plato wrote There's two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. Now to back up a little bit, some historical, this is maybe a little longer than the person wanted, but I'll give you the answer to eventually get to it. Plato was writing his dialogues in about 360 or so BC. Athens had lost its empire, its naval empire that they'd been able to control with those triremes I talked about earlier. They had lost that in a war with Sparta. It was devastating for Athenian society. But by the time that Plato was writing, Athens was beginning to rebuild and think about building another empire. Plato had lost his mentor. Socrates had been executed as a scapegoat, if you will. It was his fault because he taught things that the gods were angry with. And when Athens lost the war, they were looking for scapegoats. He was, in fact, an obvious one. Now, what Plato had done is there were two things that most Athenians remembered, and maybe more. One was there was I guess it was 427 BC, there was a tsunami that inundated a nearby island of Athens. Atalanta was called. The whole island disappeared in a massive sea wave. Then in 373 BC, the city of Haliki on the northern coast of the Peloponnese in the Gulf of Corinth, again, an earthquake occurred and the city sank beneath the sea. Also, we have no way of knowing whether or not how many people in Athens in the 4th century BC remembered anything or even knew about the great volcanic eruption that occurred on the island of Thera in the 1600s. Perhaps it had survived in some way in local legend. There also was a memory, there may or may not have been a memory of Troy, of the Trojan War, where a great advanced civilization, the city of Troy, was destroyed. Whatever it was, Plato decided to play on this, and he set a story about 9,000 years ago. Athens was part of a coalition of Greeks that were able to fend off the attack of the Atlanteans who came from outside of the Straits of Gibraltar. Of course, the problem with that is Athens was still in the Stone Age then. There wasn't anything resembling a city. Geologists tell us there was no possible geological event that would have that meant an island or sank outside the Straits of Gibraltar then. Plato was creating this story. It was a political allegory. What he was telling his people, his contemporaries, let's not go down that road again of building an empire. Look what happened to us last time. And by cloaking it in antiquity, the story perhaps was more palatable. So was there an Atlantis? Well, I guess the answer now is no. I'll get one more thing about that, which is kind of funny. People have looked for it everywhere. There was a group not in the latter part of the 20th century that thought they had found Atlantis in the Bahamas. A long stretch of beach rock was seen as some sort of a platform on which maybe spaceships had landed. And a psychic was brought in to examine columns. The psychic felt the column drums and said, these were made by people who came from the Pleiades. The Pleions had landed, and this was Atlantis. Turns out that this was natural beach rock, and the concrete goes from barrels of cement that from a place in Georgia, a ship had gone down, and so on. But people, there have been all kinds of theories locating Atlantis. So the answer was, did it exist in antiquity? No. Does it exist now? Yes. You can go to the Bahamas, stay in Paradise Island at the Atlantis Hotel. So yeah, it does exist.
So I'll read this participant's question. I read a theory that the flood stories arose from real, large but localized flooding in the Black Sea coming from rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Is there any validity to that theory?
I think so. If we're looking at just about every society has a flood legend, society of the Mediterranean. But we do know that there was a point in time where there was the Black Sea, as we now know it, did not exist, that there was a small freshwater lake, and where the Black Sea is now, people lived around the lake. There was a point in time when, again, with the melting of the glaciers in the last ice age, where there was a breach, that's Straits of the Bosphorus now, where the ocean just poured in to this lake, trapping the fresh water below the salt water. And this may well have been the origins of the flood legend. It appears first in Sumerian literature, to the best of my knowledge. It's picked up, of course, in the Judaic tradition as well. But the Sumerians had a Noah too. So it's possible if there was any kind of historical fact to that, that may be the occasion for it. I had thought before the work that was done in the Black Sea, which sounds reasonable to me. I had thought that the story might have originated when the beginning of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates, when the rivers flooded, they might have inundated the civilization that was there, limited city life that was there, and maybe that memory had survived, and maybe that was the beginnings of it. But the answer is to the question is, I think that probably is the historical germ of truth to the flood legend. Yeah.
So I'm afraid this will have to be our last question for today. And Stevi, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Stevi asks, what is the coolest thing you have ever discovered?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'll answer it this way. I had, when I worked at Caesarea, I took volunteers from around the world. At one point in time, I had 60 volunteer divers working with me. So the work continues, almost 24/7. I also brought along a lot of CU students. I always brought along maybe 10 to 15 CU students every summer. And I used to joke with them about, as a maritime archaeologist, I always wanted to find a bronze statue underwater. I had visions of a bronze hand sticking out of the sand, beckoning me. Well, on one of my seasons at Caesarea, at the end of the field work, I always took one last dive around all the various areas we're working to take one last look. And I came up to this one site, and there, sticking out of the sand, was a bronze hand. Actually, what it was a bronze hand, but it was only one finger sticking out, and that was the middle finger. And what had happened is one of my students from CU had made a ceramic hand and then painted it so it looked like it was bronze, and then had gone there ahead of me and buried it, knowing that I would in fact look at it. That's the coolest thing I ever saw, the bronze digit sticking out of the sand.
That's hilarious, and I think that's the note we have to end on. So I think it's a great note to end on in that case.
Everybody, in your time. Thank you very much.
Now, a few remarks to close out the program today. First, Bob, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. What a remarkable career. What a remarkable collection of contributions to our understanding and to science. We're grateful for your time and expertise today, and for the fantastic work that you've done. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone else who joined us today. We really appreciate your time and attention and your participation through your many excellent questions. We're all about building intellectual community through this work around the fantastic faculty work we have going on here at CU Boulder. I would like to especially appreciate Gretchen Minikheim and Jeannie McDonald. They're both members of the Office for Outreach and Engagement staff, and they have been providing technical support today. You will receive, and I should also thank our folks who are providing support for sign language, as well as the captioning function. Really appreciate those folks making these presentations as accessible as possible. Thank you for being with us as well. So everyone will receive an email after this lecture shuts down with a link to a survey. We appreciate your feedback. We are looking towards the lecture series in the fall, and your feedback will help us to understand where interests lie and any ways that we can improve upon these events. We really appreciate anything you have to offer there. So please do fill out that survey. A recording of the lecture will be available online by the end of the day on Monday. And you can find this on the See You on the Weekend webpage, which is where you registered for today's lecture. And note that the recording will also be closed captioned. This has been the third installment of our spring 2022 See You on the Weekend lecture series. Coming up next is May 14th. We will have Professor Celeste Montoya, who is an associate professor of women and gender studies, presenting a lecture titled Presente, Latina Legislative Leadership in the Colorado General Assembly. So please join us for that. That'll be the lecture that closes out our spring series. And we just really appreciate your attending, and we look forward to seeing you at another lecture in the future.